The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" I said, "O sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, this is what the Lord, the sovereign Lord, says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live.' So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone, and we are cut off. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord, and I have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you. Well, people of peace, it is a joy to be with you again this final Sunday of May, and especially since it's Pentecost Sunday, this time of celebration. But Pentecost begins in a small, dark room. And the Old Testament Pentecost that we read here in Ezekiel, it begins in a valley of dead, dry bones. Can you sense that place of death? Can you feel it? Maybe a place in your own life or own community where you're like, oh, I feel the despair. 10 years ago, I was in a place like this where I would be able to get up enough energy to preach on a Sunday morning, and for the rest of the week, I basically stayed in bed. It was a time I would later come to know as a depression, but at the time it just felt like the valley of dry bones, a place of death and despair where I'd wake up every morning and I'd ask God, why did you let me wake up this morning? Please just let me go. It was that dry bones feel where Ezekiel finds himself at the beginning of this passage. It's interesting, this passage was one that was read during the Passover season on whatever Sabbath, whenever Sabbath fell during that Passover celebration, they would read, and they do read, this story, where Israel is reminded once again that God can make a people out of what seems a valley of dry bones. Where it seems hopeless, God can bring life. And so God begins by asking this question of his servant Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these dry bones live?" It's the question that starts this passage, but it's a question that echoes throughout these 14 verses. The challenge, the question, can these dry bones live? And as Ezekiel looks around at the beginning of this passage, there's an obvious answer. He must have wondered, "Lord, is this a trick question? It seems obvious. No, of course not." He's brought by the Spirit into this valley, probably the site of an ancient battle, where the victors had had one last act of humiliation by not burying those they had defeated. And so this valley is full of dry bones. The battle was lost long ago. And so when God asks Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" he's thinking, well, it seems obvious, of course not, but, well, it's God asking the question, and so he ends up doing this. I don't know. Have you seen those answers before? "Hey, who left their dirty clothes in the living room?" I don't know. "Who didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher?" I don't know. It's a mystery to me. At least it's a mystery to me when I don't put them away. I don't know. So Ezekiel goes with this kind of, "Only you know, Lord?" Kind of a safe equivocation. He doesn't know exactly, but maybe God does. See, the prophet Ezekiel, he's prone to some wild visions. One of my pastor friends, before he came to faith, was convinced Ezekiel was high half the time because the things he sees, it just doesn't seem possible. But Ezekiel's ministry was to show Israel through these visions and through acts, God's perspective on their lived reality. And so using these visions, he had warned of judgment. He'd brought messages of hope. So when God asks him, "Son of man, can these dry bones live?" Ezekiel knows there's more going on here than just human skeletal remains. It's not just a daydream about a distant battlefield. In fact, God lets him know. Like he tells him, here's what this means. The bones were the people of Israel, not dead ones from a battle, but ones who were physically alive, but now spiritually and emotionally dead, despairing their current situation. God says, look at these dry bones. The people who had been my people, Israel. Ezekiel, can these dry bones live? Ezekiel may have given a shrug, but if you ask the people of Israel, they'd had no question about the answer. They're like, no way. We can't live. I mean, look. Verse 11 tells us their perspective of their situation. Our bones are dried up. Our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. Can we live? No way. It's not possible. And look at their political situation. Who would blame them? Their situation at the time is Babylon is this behemoth who has taken over their known world. Judah, during Babylon's rise, had made some critical errors. Spiritually, they turned to idols of other nations. Politically and the military-wise, they had decided they would side with Egypt against Babylon. That turned out to be a critical error. And so Babylon had already defeated Egypt and Judah and company once. Many people had been taken to Babylon. There were some left, and Babylon had set up a vassal king. Kind of a halfway measure, giving them another chance. But when that vassal king decided he too was going to turn on Babylon one more time and fight them, when he rose up against them, Babylon said, no more. No more half measures. Jerusalem's destroyed. The temple is destroyed. More people are taken away. The kingly line is cut off. Every single symbol that had told Judah that we are God's people, all that was taken away. all the symbols that gave meaning to their life are gone. Long gone. And so by this point in Judah's story, their bones are dry and white. And so their assessment of themselves, we are cut off. Cut off from life, cut off from meaning, and most of all, cut off from God. At least that's what they thought. Ezekiel, he was no stranger to this national defeat. It had hit home. He too had lost during exile. He too had lost when the temple was destroyed as he lost his place of employment. He too had lost even his wife to death. And while few of us may have faced this type of loss, being refugees from war, I think there's dry bones in every closet where we look at parts of our own life, our church, our community, friends' lives, and we despair. When God asks, can these dry bones live? Maybe outside we give God a shrug, but inside we're with Israel. No way. No way. That battle is long, long lost. Of course not. The bones are dry. But Ezekiel sees something sometimes we don't. Sometimes we lose perspective of that the person asking the question makes a huge difference. It's God asking the question. And so when Ezekiel starts with this on the fence, maybe that's the beginning of faith. Maybe doubt shows that Ezekiel sees something that we don't. It seems impossible, but God did create from dust and raise the dead. So it doesn't seem likely, but Lord, only you know. So Ezekiel's told to do two things in this seemingly impossible situation. Prophesy to the bones, prophesy to the breath. Speaking to the bones, it seems ridiculous, but he does, and when he does, God begins to work, and bones come together, and tendons and flesh and skin cover them. It sounds kind of like a scene out of a horror movie, except this is in reverse because life is coming back. But at some point that stops, and like the first man created out of dust, these are still lifeless, human-shaped dolls with no breath. And so Ezekiel is now told, prophesy to the breath, to the wind, to the spirit. It's the same word in Hebrew. Breath, wind, and spirit. And this is the part of the movie where you'd hear a drum roll. Because what's going to happen? There's been a central question. Can these dry bones live? That seems impossible. But Ezekiel is told to do this thing. Prophesy to the breath. What will happen? Can these dry bones live? And we discover when Ezekiel does what he's told, he prophesies to the breath, the wind, and the spirit. And we discover Ezekiel was right. Lord, you do know the answer to your question. Can these bones live? And God's answer was so different from Israel's. Yes, they can live. And breath enters these hopelessly dead, dry bones, and they rise and they wait expectantly on God's next word. It's a beautiful vision, but just a vision, right? I mean, this is Ezekiel, who saw wheels on fire and things like that. Can these dry bones actually live? See, that beginning question in Ezekiel 37 is also a question for our own lives, our real lives. When life seems tenuous at best, or completely lost, is there any reason for hope? Can these dry bones live? Can modern day Ezekiels sitting here today who know their own loss, who know their own fallibility, standing in the face of great despair, can we still speak a word of hope? Or at least Ezekiel's, God knows, can they live? God's history says yes. God's history says yes. Some of those dry bones will stand. And in fact, they do. Thanks to God's intervention, some of the people get to go home. The dry bones lived. And even better than that, thanks to God's work, a small group of them will truly become, as God defines them, my people. Because when he promises to restore them to their soil, he's not just talking about dirt. The bigger context is this, that the dirt, the temple, the kingly line were always meant to point them to God. And so when he asks, can these dry bones live? The question is not just, will you be back on your own dirt, but will your heart belong to God? That is the question that's being asked. He says, you shall know that I am the Lord. A people's heart returning to God. And so today, on Pentecost, we celebrate how 11 and then 120 scared, confused, hopeless followers of Jesus were filled with the Spirit, were connected with God's life, and reached out this message of hope to a wider world in languages they understood. Dry bones lived, and the church was born, and we are a part of God's gift of new creation in a valley of death. But here we are, Peace Church, Richmond, British Columbia, hundreds of generations removed from the church's birth, and every new generation and every new follower of Jesus is asked this same question: can the dry bones live? When the life, your life, or those you love has been crushed, can these dry bones live? When we trusted in something to give us life that was untrustworthy, like Israel trusted Egypt, can they live? When careers didn't work out, like when the temple fell for Ezekiel, can it live? When places that felt like home were taken away, when things we trusted for life got precarious and then unlivable, when all has crashed, hope seems gone, can these dry bones live? Think about the places of death in your own life, in the life of those you love. Really, do you have hope that there can be life there again? It's not just in God's history I've heard this resounding answer, yes. In my own valley of dry bones, I've felt the yes. I've told this story to some of you, but I only have so many good stories, and so I'll tell it again. In my own place of death, God answered by his Spirit when I thought, no, there's no way. I'm with Israel. We're cut off. I'm cut off. God, through his Spirit, graciously supplied people to show me that life was possible. He graciously gave me a wife who was resilient and stuck with me when I gave up. He graciously gave me a member of my board who said, Matt, I know you can't be in the church right now, but I'm just going to pay for you to have spiritual direction so you can stay as connected to God as possible in this darkness. He gave me a walk-in doctor. When I couldn't find a family doctor, I walked into some random walk-in clinic, and here was a young Muslim doctor. And she said, you know what I'm going to do for you, Matt? I work in 3 different walk-in clinics, and I'm going to give you my schedule, all 3, so you can just come and I'll follow you until you get stronger. And she got me access to medication that gave me the strength to face some of the darkness that I had to face. Can the dry bones live? Oh yeah, I've seen it. Life looks different, but the answer is yes. Dry bones can live as we receive life as defined by the life giver. When Judah returned to their land, it was a different land. The temple that was rebuilt was smaller, and people lamented Solomon's temple. When they returned, there were Gentiles in the land. David's kingly line would never quite be the same. In fact, one who would come centuries later and call himself the son of David looked nothing like the king they expected. But land and temple and king were always meant to point beyond the objects to God himself. Can these dry bones live? Absolutely. It may look different. It may. But God's life can always enter a human life. The Spirit is always present. How can I say that? Because of what happens when Ezekiel prophesies to the Spirit, prophesies to the wind. He is told to call it from 4 directions, the 4 winds. The implication is the breath of God surrounds us, while land and temple and king is tenuous and can be taken away. We see in Ezekiel that the life of God, the Spirit of God, is neither tenuous nor sparse. There is enough of God to go around. Yes, dry bones can live. We are never fully cut off from the life of God, not because of what we are like, but because of what He is like. The Spirit of God is enough. So to be modern day Ezekiel's is to speak and pray and live as if the Spirit is already at work, even if all we can see is dry bones, including our own. On Pentecost, the Spirit filled and spoke through 120 disciples at once in different languages to different needs and different manifestations of death. God formed His people. There is enough of God to restore life long dead. So can those dry bones live? Absolutely. As the lives of the questioned live out the answer. I love it that this question is put to Ezekiel, one invited to speak for God while he himself is confused and lost. And yet we learn through Ezekiel's life and ministry that God had sustained him through exile and persecution and ridicule and deep personal loss. In fact, we learn that it was God who moved Ezekiel into the middle of those dry bones. And so even in our own life, our own loss, our own valley of dry bones, the question God puts to us invites our life to answer. If the Spirit can move Ezekiel, if the Spirit can bring flesh and together there and fill with Spirit there, then I wonder if the Spirit of God can use our life. Maybe even our own confusion and dry bones. Maybe when all the best we can muster is I don't know. You know, Lord. And just maybe, when others think they are completely cut off from God's Spirit, you can hold on to hope for them and with them that these dry bones can live. God says this amazing promise near the end of the text, I will put my Spirit in you and you will live. I get to be at a place every week filled with despair. And so I get to practice this a lot when all I can see is dry bones and all the people in front of me can feel is despair. It can be hard to see signs of God's Spirit. But I've seen Him at work. One of a woman I'll call Mary, who lives in one of our long-term care communities in Victoria, had become a follower of Jesus. She was from a Jewish background, but was learning to relate to God as Jesus and was finding it really complicated. And so her chaplain said, you know, Mary, you like to write. Why don't you start to just process some of your grief and loss through writing with Jesus? And maybe, you know, it'd be helpful to have a community around you. And so Mary was like, that's great. I'll start a writer's group. He hadn't thought of that, but she did. And so she gathered a group of women who started to write out and process things they were going through. And one of the women who came to this group was a woman I'll call Agnes, a follower of Jesus from an indigenous background, a survivor of the residential schools. And as Mary took a step forward and started to write and invited these women into community, and Agnes entered and started to write, things flowed out of Agnes that she'd never been able to share with anybody. Dry bones can live. What God says is true. I will put my Spirit in you, and you will live. Let's pray. when all we can see is dry bones. Give us courage and hope to believe that we are your people and that your Spirit surrounds us. So breathe on us, breath of God. Fill us with life anew. Help us to love as you would love and do as you would do. In the name of your Son, amen.